New videos every day. Life, wisdom. I'm Psychetruth Correspondent Corrina Rachel, and on this episode of the Truth Talks, we're going to talk about grains. Are they a healthy source of vitamins and nutrients, or should we avoid them? I'm talking today with Dr. Vincent Bellonzi. Thank you so much for joining me.
Here.
So you talk in your book a little bit about grains, and I wanted to discuss that in this video because a lot of people have grain sensitivities or they have been advised not to eat grains. Maybe you can just tell us, are grains really as dangerous as some people have made them out to be?
I would say for the majority of people, the answer is yes. The problem is that the grains that we're eating today are not the same grains that we ate in the past. They have changed the gluten content, they've changed the starch content. Of course, if you're producing a grain, you want to get more money for it, so the food has been altered, but it also perhaps increases the dose of things that cause problems for people. Some people can tolerate grains, but if you're going to consume grains, you need to be consuming the grain itself, like a hot cereal, for example. If you're eating donuts and bagels and all these other things, not that you can never have one, but if you're eating those types of foods frequently, you're getting a food-like substance. You're getting a lot of preservatives and chemicals, you're getting things from the packaging, and you're just eating a bunch of starch. If you want to get the value from the grains, you have to talk about the oils, which are already gone. You have to talk about the fiber or the bran, which is gone. And you just have this white starch that might be even colored a little bit, so you think you're eating something healthy, but it's not. The problem is that we can feed a lot of people with grains, so I don't know what the answer would be to that. We're probably going to have to continue to use them, especially in some areas of the world. But it's not necessarily the healthiest choice.
Okay, so you're saying that maybe the first point is to just make a distinction, and this is kind of related to what we were talking about in the last video about real food versus fake foods. So when we're talking about the way that most of our grains are being processed now, the refined white flour that you find pretty much in any conventional food, that would be considered a food-like substance or a fake food. Those have a lot of negative health effects. We want to avoid those pretty much at all costs, no matter what.
Yes, because again, you're primarily eating flour and you're not going to be getting the nutritional value out of that. You need other nutrients in your food. There's nothing like a vegetable, jam-packed, nutrient-dense, and then a little bit of carbohydrate. If you're eating all carbohydrate and getting one or two little nutrients, well, that's not the same thing. And then again, a lot of things are added to these. Sometimes they put food coloring in so the kids will want to eat it, and they make it flaked or they make it into little shapes, and then they add some marshmallows, and you're not eating anything healthy.
Yeah, and I've actually on the back of a wheat bread label one time, I was like, oh, I'll just turn it over and take a look. It was made with the same flour as the other bread, the enriched white flour, and it just had caramel color added to it. And I thought, okay, so
and everybody has the idea it's so much healthier.
Yeah,
right?
so that you feel like, oh, I'm going to eat the wheat bread. I'm going to be the healthy, do the healthy choice. But a lot of times, you really do have to look for that 100% whole wheat flour on the back of the label, because they'll use these colorings to make the white bread, look more healthy and kind of trick people into thinking that it's good for them.
There are some breads, especially that come from Europe. I don't know of a company that makes them here, but that are very dense. You can still see a bunch of seeds in them. They're not melting in your mouth. They're not just starch. That'd be a little healthier. But again, ideally, if you're going to consume grains, go all the way back to the grain itself. And there are some people who aren't going to do well with grains at all and probably should avoid them.
Okay. So in terms of some of these grains that you would recommend, when you talk about eating the real grain or eating the whole grain, can you maybe elaborate on that?
Well, again, think of a hot cereal, steel-cut oats, or the wheat groats, they call them, the wheat hearts. Think of pretty much coming off the field and putting it in a bowl and heating it up. Generally, we're going to have to heat it up to soften it because it's very fibrous. Many people won't be able to digest it. I mean, some people do. I've eaten grains raw. You probably do a little bit better if you steam them or heat them a little bit just for digestion. But you take it beyond that, and there's going to be more and more loss. So we have to get back to the idea of real original food and if it's got value for us. And as I mentioned earlier, we've grown different plants than we used to. It's produced different seeds. So now the gluten content is higher. There are other things changed in the plant. Some of it's genetically modified. We just don't have those original foods, and the body may not be able to accept it that well.
Right. So one of the things I've heard is that the prevalence of gluten sensitivity or celiac disease that we really are kind of seeing on the rise, there's more and more people with sensitivities to gluten, that some of that could actually be attributable to the way that the grains are processed. Is there any truth in that?
To the strain of the grain and the difference in today's grains from the past. For example, I've had patients who travel to Europe and they're able to eat bread and not really notice much of a problem. Not that you want to just rely on symptoms, but they're able to tolerate some of the breads because they have more original grains over there. But if they eat a food here, the gluten content is so much higher, they tend to have a lot of symptoms. So that's one example. And we do tend to do a lot more to our foods to preserve them, to do things with them. So you're getting a little different package when you eat the grains here. And again, it is just starch. But the gluten, there's gluten in every grain, but there's a certain class that is we call gluten free if we don't eat them, basically. But there's a certain class of grasses that has a gluten that tends to bother most people, or most of the people that are sensitive. And it used to be that we thought maybe 15 to 20% of people were gluten sensitive, and then a small portion of those were celiac. Celiac is kind of an extreme gluten sensitivity. It's where there's actual damage to the intestines. But now we're finding the numbers running as high as 60, 70, maybe even 80% of people that are gluten sensitive, and then a small portion of those have celiac disease. If you've got celiac disease, you've got no business eating grains. It's going to harm you. If you've got a gluten sensitivity, you're going to have reactivity, but there could be some permanent harm as well. So for some people, we will have them gluten-free. That doesn't mean healthy. It simply means gluten-free. Because there are a lot of gluten-free foods that are just, again, starch.
Right.
So we have to make that differentiation.
Right. So for people who are gluten-free, for instance, what kind of since they're going to have to take a lot of things out of their diet if they are used to eating flour
as far as grain products,
grain products go, what would be some other foods you would suggest they add into their diet that maybe they might not even be familiar with?
Well, in going gluten-free, we want to get away from that one class, which the major grains in there are wheat, rye, and barley. Oats actually, for many people, has a safe gluten, but it gets included because in this country, in the processing of grains, we process everything that's together, and most of the oats in this country are contaminated, so they got thrown in there. Wow. So many people will, if they prescribe you a gluten-free diet, will say you're going to have to avoid wheat, rye, barley, and oats. But you also have to think of spelt and some other related grasses in that class. Buckwheat is a little different. So many people that are gluten sensitive can eat buckwheat. There's quinoa, there's millet. So there's a few other grains you can substitute. There's even bean flours and tapioca flours and things to use as a substitute. But if you are sensitive to grains overall, you're probably going to be better to predominantly eat vegetables and fruits and meats and other things and not necessarily depend on grains.
Right. So in terms of grains affecting our health, what about how grains affect weight gain or maybe our ability to lose weight if we're trying to lose weight?
Well, remember that you're eating flour, which is a starch. And if you eat a lot of starches and you don't burn those calories or put them away, they're going to turn into triglycerides, cause other problems, but they're going to cause weight gain because everything that you don't burn is going to be stored. So it's just like eating sugar out of the sugar bowl. If you're consuming a lot of starch, a lot of flour, you're just eating carbohydrate. Mm-hmm. And it's a simple, easily digested carbohydrate, which means that it's going to be very quickly into your body. It's going to shock your body with the speed that it can come in. If I eat a vegetable, for example, I'm going to get some carbohydrates, but I have to go through a digestive process and slowly extract that carbohydrate. No shock at all. But if I'm eating a lot of breads and cereals and sticky buns and whatever, then I'm getting the flour and then some added sugar, and of course, I'm going to have problems with weight because there's just an excess of calories and not the nutrients there to even help me metabolize it.
Right. So in terms of, you brought up this concept of a simple carbohydrate. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on the difference between simple and complex and how maybe people could identify them?
There are some simple carbohydrates that are actually safe to eat. It's more so, I like to go to glycemic index. How much impact is that food going to have on you? How quickly can your body turn that food into blood sugar in your blood? That's really the impact we're looking at. And breads and cereals, it's right there. You might as well inject it into the vein. practically in your mouth. You're putting it right into your blood. But again, as I said, if I'm eating even a fruit, a whole fruit, not juices, or a vegetable or something else, I'm going to have to slowly bring that in. So the glycemic index as a measure is less, meaning that that food has less impact on my blood sugar, which is what we're going to have to talk about even in relation to weight gain.
Right. And what would be some examples of low glycemic foods?
Well, proteins are low glycemic, absolutely. So make sure you're getting sufficient protein in your diet. Most vegetables are very low glycemic index, usually coming in well under 50. A lot of fruits actually are 50 or less, more fibrous fruits, not the tropical fruits necessarily, which are a little higher. But food in general has a fairly low glycemic index. The things that are really high are the processed foods. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that when they made the glycemic index, they needed a standard, and they used white bread and sugar as a standard. Both had the same impact on the body. They were set at 100, and then numbers lower than that are more desirable.
Right.
So if you consider that white bread can be used to set the glycemic index, maybe it's not the greatest thing to consume.
Right. So in terms of if we are wanting to lose weight, one of the first things to avoid would be white bread and sugar,
yes,
since they are the highest glycemic, wreak the most havoc on your blood sugar. Yeah. Are there any other comments about grains that you would want to offer to people who are maybe trying to decide, I don't know if they're good for me, I don't know if they're bad for me? You know, I think a lot of people, there's so much just contradicting information out there about different foods and things like that, that at some point it kind of becomes difficult for people to know, is this healthy or is this unhealthy? One
thing that people need to realize is if you're not very healthy in the first place, and if you do have a sensitivity to these grains, especially those grains containing gluten, which wheat is so, the most common thing that we consume, the gluten particles, if your digestive tract isn't in real good shape, will actually do what's called leak through. There's a permeability established because your gut's not real healthy, which is most of the American public. The gluten particles will run through the body, and wherever they land, they're going to create inflammation. So they're tying the intake of gluten to Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. They're tying it to joint pains. They're tying it to inflammation of pancreas, of liver. Basically, the gluten particles traveling around, and wherever it ends up, like I said, it's going to create an inflammatory process. And that's the biggest danger with gluten.
Wow.
So there's a small portion of people that are healthy enough and can use the grains. Maybe it's more in their ancestry, but whole grains would be better and not have this go on. But a great number of people are sensitive and are going to have these repercussions.
Right. And so that's leaky gut syndrome. Is that what you're referencing?
Gluten is one of the causes. There's many causes, but we see chlorine and other chemicals causing it. But gluten is one of the big causes of what we call leaky gut syndrome, which is a real syndrome. Mm-hmm. The medical people call it increased intestinal permeability, but leaky gut explains exactly what's going on.
Right. That is incredibly interesting. Well, I want to thank you so much. I think that's about all we have time for today. And I want to thank you for watching. If you'd like to learn more, then I suggest that you check out Dr. Bellonzi's new book. It's called Health, Recklessly Abandoned. And it's available on Amazon or at the link in the description. And I hope that you will like this video. If you found it useful, please share it with your friends. Please be sure to leave any comments or questions you may have about future video topics and future Truth Talks. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.